In the mud-choked trenches of World War I, generals searched for answers as machine guns carved entire battalions into silence. While armies clung to outdated doctrine, one quiet American mechanic studied a puff of gas bending grass at a shooting range and saw a force no one else recognized. That mechanic was John Moses Browning, a man with no formal engineering education, yet destined to redesign the battlefield forever. He didn't chase war. He chased mechanical truth, and his inventions would echo through every major conflict that followed. Before we begin, subscribe. He was born where iron sang. In Ogden, Utah, John Moses Browning's first classroom was a gunsmith's shop tacked onto the family home, where heat shimmered over anvils and the air smelled of oil and coal. While other children traded marbles, he sorted screws, traced springs, and watched his father, Jonathan, turn raw steel into rifles settlers trusted. Curiosity came factory-installed. At 13, he assembled a rifle from scrap, not because anyone asked, but because the mechanism in his head wouldn't stop clicking until the parts obeyed. He learned by touch how heat loosens, how cold tightens, how a thousandth-inch mistake becomes a jam at the worst moment. Faith shaped his discipline. Frontier necessity shaped his standards. Tools were sermons on precision, and the shop bell a metronome for patience. Where most saw a trigger as a finger's lever, he saw a conversation between geometry and time. He grew fluent in the grammar of recoil, friction, and spring rate, and preferred answers that used nature's force instead of fighting it. Copying a pattern bored him. Simplifying one thrilled him. He sketched in pencil, then corrected in steel, letting file and hammer tell him which idea deserved to live. Each failure went into a quiet ledger: cause, effect, remedy. And each success earned only a nod before the next problem called. By his 20s, he was selling designs to major firms, but the shop in Ogden stayed his anchor. Brothers helped, customers knocked, and desert light spilled across benches crowded with partly solved puzzles. He kept a hunter's eye for reliability. Dirt, rain, and cold were not excuses. They were test conditions. If a device could not be stripped without a toolbox or cleaned with a rag, it was not finished. That pragmatism planted the seed of a revolution, the belief that a gun could cycle itself with the energy it already spent, simply and repeatably. Before the world named him the century's great armorer, John Browning was just a mechanic translating physics into trust. The idea didn't arrive with trumpets. It came on a quiet shooting range in 1890, where afternoon heat bent the air and dust clung to boots. John Browning was testing yet another rifle, noting each puff of smoke and each ejected case. Then he noticed something no one else ever bothered to watch. Hot gases blasting from the muzzle bent the grass with violent force. Not a gentle sway, more like an invisible hammer striking the earth. Hunters saw it every day. Soldiers ignored it. But in Browning's head, gears clanked awake. That energy was wasted. Wasted energy meant wasted opportunity. He froze, listening to his own breath. What if you could trap that force? Direct it? Harness each shot to power the next? The puzzle clicked into place. He sprinted back to his shop, sketches forming faster than his pencil could move. Even his brothers recognized the look. Sleepless excitement, hunger for a solution. Turning a concept into steel was another matter entirely. Gas pressures varied wildly from shot to shot. Steel expanded under heat. Timing fractions of a second off meant shattered parts, or worse, exploding receivers. The first prototype blew apart in a shower of springs. The second jammed like a rusted gate. The third lasted 20 rounds before seizing. Each failure fueled obsession. Browning didn't complain. He adjusted tolerances, shaved a millimeter here, thickened a wall there, trying metals until he understood how heat traveled through each one. He talked to springs as if coaxing secrets. Bit by bit, the mechanism matured. A gas port bleeding pressure into a cylinder, a piston driving the bolt, a spring returning it home. The system breathed, cycled, ejected, loaded again and again, until his workshop echoed with a continuous roar unlike anything in America. It wasn't beauty, but it worked. Darkness bruised his eyes from lack of sleep, yet he grinned like a man who'd just glimpsed the future. Browning knew instantly what others wouldn't learn for years. Wars were about to change. Continuous fire was no longer tethered to bulky tripods or water-cooled monstrosities. With gas as his engine, he had discovered not just a weapon, but a principle. And principles can't be forgotten. They ripple forward forever. When Browning finally unveiled his invention in 1891, he didn't bring theatrics. He wheeled out a squat, unassuming machine gun, set its ammunition belt on the demonstration table, and waited patiently while bored officers filed in. These were men raised on Civil War doctrine, rows of infantry, cavalry charges, and battlefield etiquette. To them, firepower was something you aimed once, not a fountain of bullets. Browning loaded the belt, braced the tripod, and squeezed the trigger. What followed sounded like thunder trapped in a box. The weapon spat brass like angry bees, chewing a wooden target into splinters. Test officers flinched. The sound echoed down the range like a train rattling off its tracks. When the final round clinked to the ground, Browning exhaled, certain he'd just changed history. Silence answered him. A general cleared his throat and described the weapon as technically interesting but unnecessary. Another said machine guns were too heavy to matter anywhere except fortress walls. Others dismissed automatic weapons entirely, insisting battlefield officers would never tolerate soldiers wasting ammunition. One shrugged that the Maxim gun already existed. What more could anyone need? The door slammed shut on innovation. The problem wasn't the machine, it was the mindset. Armies still treated war like chess, a game of measured volleys, not chaos. They didn't believe a single team could stop hundreds. They had no concept of trench warfare's grim reality. They couldn't imagine a battlefield shaped by streams of lead rather than by marching formations. Browning tried explaining reliability, fewer moving parts, faster production. He might as well have been speaking in code. He left Washington with his invention boxed in silence. But the rejection didn't crush him. It hardened his resolve. If the world wasn't ready, he would keep building until they were forced to notice. In his workshop, he refined triggers, shaved down springs, and polished channels until the weapon purred like a sewing machine. Some inventions are born in applause. Others wait in the dark until the world catches up. Browning's waited, humming quietly behind a locked door, while history inched toward a nightmare only his weapon could answer. 2 decades after Browning's quiet humiliation, Europe ignited like dry grass. What began with an assassination in Sarajevo spiraled into alliances, ultimatums, and mobilizations. By 1914, millions of young men marched toward war expecting cavalry glories and swift victories. Within months, they were buried chest-deep in mud, staring across blasted fields of wire and cratered earth. Industrial firepower, artillery, barbed wire, and heavy machine guns froze entire armies in place. The battlefield no longer resembled open ground. It looked like a metallic meat grinder. On the Western Front, generals watched in horror as frontal assaults evaporated under streams of bullets. Waves of soldiers sprinted into no man's land, only to collapse like grass before a scythe. The Maxim machine gun, once a curiosity, became the undisputed king of defense. Mud-clogged gears, water jackets burst, and barrels hissed like kettles, but the guns kept killing. Attrition replaced maneuver. Days became months. Millions died without either side gaining more than yards. American military observers sent reports home. Machine guns weren't decorations. They were battlefield dictators. Yet back in Washington, procurement was a tangle of bureaucracy and outdated doctrine. When the United States finally joined the war in 1917, it discovered a terrifying truth. There weren't enough machine guns to arm the new American expeditionary forces. Production lines strained, officers panicked, and soldiers drilled with wooden mock-ups. In that moment of crisis, dusty files were cracked open. Someone remembered the quiet mechanic from Utah, Browning. Suddenly, the same generals who once waved him out of the room sent urgent telegrams demanding demonstrations. Browning, now older and gray at the temples, arrived carrying not just his gas-operated gun, but something new, an even simpler, recoil-driven heavy machine gun, built to survive hell. On the proving ground, both weapons roared. They didn't jam, they didn't leak, they didn't choke on mud. Officers who once smirked now leaned forward, whispering feverishly. Browning had solved every problem the trenches exposed: reliability, cooling, sustained fire, ease of repair. The war was no longer theoretical. It swallowed nations whole. Bureaucrats stopped laughing. But time was the enemy now. Factories had to be converted, workers trained, parts standardized, logistics mapped. Browning threw himself into the process, sleeping in workshops, sketching redesigns on scraps of paper, shaving minutes off assembly by rearranging tolerances. He treated production like combat. Every hour lost cost lives at the front. It was the moment his destiny intersected with history's darkest chapter. The world had built trenches of mud and wire. Browning built a weapon to break them open. As American troops poured into France, Browning's machine guns entered a brutal proving ground. The trenches were not simply defensive earthworks. They were chemical laboratories of destruction. Mud behaved like glue, choking mechanisms. Nights froze steel solid. Mornings cooked it in humidity. Fine dust from explosions drifted into every hinge and chamber. Weapons designed in polished workshops were reduced to scrap by nature's indifference. But Browning had built his guns for environments exactly like this: hostile, unpredictable, merciless. The first shipments of his M1917 heavy machine guns arrived in battered crates. Army armorers were skeptical until they assembled the parts. Soldiers immediately noticed something foreign: simplicity. Instead of a labyrinth of delicate components, the M1917's interior looked like clockwork, engineered by a minimalist. Where the Maxim had hundreds of tiny moving pieces, Browning's gun had far fewer, and each was rugged, overbuilt. If something wore down, it bent instead of snapping. If it gummed with mud, a quick rinse restored function. This was not elegance, it was survival. When the first Browning guns fired in combat, the reaction was disbelief. They roared continuously, even as men frantically fed belts of ammunition like lifelines. Empty casings poured to the ground in glittering piles, while the weapon refused to jam. Enemy troops, accustomed to seeing opposing guns choke, suddenly faced relentless streams of fire. The psychological shock mattered as much as the physical devastation. But Browning's genius wasn't limited to heavy weapons. Alongside the M1917 arrived his leaner creation: The Browning automatic rifle. The BAR infantry squads now possessed portable automatic fire, something European commanders had dismissed as fantasy. Doughboys maneuvered behind bar bursts, slicing through enemy positions once guarded by static machine gun nests. It wasn't just firepower, it was mobility. Armies that once stomped forward like iron phalanxes now pivoted, sprinted, suppressed, and flanked. The battlefield shifted. Soldiers began trusting their equipment in ways impossible before. Reports spread through muddy trenches. The Browning guns just didn't quit. Crews bragged about firing thousands of rounds without stoppage. One account described an M1917 buried in wet clay by an artillery blast. Its crew dug it out, cleaned it with their sleeves, and it returned to service moments later. German officers captured in the chaos asked repeatedly, "Who built these?" There were still obstacles. Barrels overheated in sustained fire, glowing red like molten iron. Ammunition supply lines stretched and snapped under demand. Browning adjusted designs, proposing quick-change barrels and mounting points for improved cooling. His engineering notebooks became wartime scripture. Factories followed line by line. By the time autumn fog settled over the Western Front, Browning's weapons were no longer novelties. They were lifelines. The deafening roar of the M1917 became the soundtrack of advancing infantry. Commanders who once wrote dismissive reports now requested hundreds more. In muddy dugouts lit by flickering lanterns, soldiers carved initials into their Brownings. They didn't see a clever mechanical system, they saw a promise that when they pulled the trigger, it would respond. In war, that bond might be the only thing stronger than fear. The United States entered World War I painfully unprepared. Ammunition depots were sparse, machine guns obsolete, and factories still geared toward peacetime production. When the War Department approved Browning's designs, they weren't just buying weapons, they were igniting a race against time. Every week of delay meant more coffins shipped home. Industrial America pivoted overnight. Automobile plants, sewing machine companies, and even typewriter manufacturers were conscripted into the war machine. Assembly lines that once crafted household goods now rattled with the thunder of steel bolts and rivets. Technical drawings traveled by train from Washington to factories nationwide. Each blueprint stamped with urgency. Production priority, immediate. Browning wasn't a distant genius who signed paperwork and disappeared. He became a ghost on the factory floor, appearing at midnight beside workers struggling with hardened steel, then reappearing at dawn in another state, offering redesigns scribbled on envelopes or scraps of wood. Engineers marveled at his intuitive solutions. He could look at a jammed component and instantly diagnose metal fatigue, gas pressure imbalance, or spring tension variance. There were bottlenecks everywhere. Metallurgists struggled to produce steel that could withstand the heat of continuous fire. Cutting tools dulled after a handful of passes. Bolts warped under microscopic misalignments. Browning revised tolerances, sometimes by fractions of a millimeter. And suddenly parts that once failed under stress now cycled thousands of rounds. His quiet genius translated into lifespans measured in battles, not minutes. Another challenge was interchangeability. A soldier in France needed to replace a damaged firing pin with one manufactured weeks later in Ohio, and it had to fit perfectly. That meant precision machining at a scale America had never attempted. Quality inspectors with magnifying lenses scrutinized each component. Workers signed their initials on every batch, knowing lives depended on those marks. Then something unexpected happened. Women flooded the workforce. With men overseas, it was women who shaped the barrels, milled receivers, and packed ammunition belts. They excelled at delicate tolerances, stabilizing an industry under enormous pressure. Newspapers dubbed them Browning's Angels, though most had never met the man. By early 1918, production reached stunning levels. Special trains thundered across the country, loaded with crates of freshly born firepower. At ports, longshoremen heaved boxes marked Browning, handle with care, onto ships bound for France. Soldiers overseas wrote home about the mysterious weapons rumored on the docks. Yet Browning refused to rest. He prowled factories like a doctor in a triage ward, diagnosing mechanical illnesses, solving bottlenecks before they metastasized. His notebooks were filled with sketches, notations, and ideas to accelerate production without compromising strength. Better to ship one perfect weapon, he wrote, than 10 that fail when fear is highest. As crates vanished into cargo holds, factory whistles sang shift changes. Sparks flew, gears screamed, and steel softened under furnaces. America had become a nation of machinists. Every turn of a wrench echoed the desperation of boys in foreign trenches. When the first Browning guns thundered across no man's land, their reliability wasn't just engineering. It was the result of thousands of hands, countless sleepless nights, and a nation learning, under fire, how to mass-produce survival. For many soldiers, the weapon's roar was more than firepower. It was the sound of an entire country standing beside them. The arrival of Browning's weapons on the Western Front was met with a mix of anticipation and desperation. American forces had been fighting with borrowed equipment, often relying on French and British machine guns that jammed in mud-soaked trenches. When the crates labeled U.S. Ordnance Browning finally appeared, officers treated them like sacred artifacts. Soldiers gathered around as instructors unpacked barrels and bolts, their hands trembling with equal parts curiosity and hope. Training was brutal and condensed. Sergeants drilled crews to assemble, disassemble, clean, and reassemble the machine gun blindfolded. They practiced loading belts until their fingertips bled. They learned to replace barrels under fire, to cool systems with mud-soaked rags, to improvise when manuals failed. Every exercise whispered the same promise: this weapon will not abandon you. The first true test came in the spring of 1918 during the German offensives. Columns of gray-coated infantry emerged from morning fog, surging toward thin American lines. Browning machine guns opened up in a thunderous chorus, deep, confident, unwavering. German troops, accustomed to the sputtering rhythms of older guns, were stunned by the uninterrupted roar. Waves collapsed before reaching American wire. Entire assaults were blunted by a single gun crew. Within days, rumors spread across Allied trenches. The Americans brought something new. Their machine guns don't choke. They fire forever. Soldiers who had survived months of unreliable weapons felt a surge of morale. Across no man's land, German observers noted in their diaries, "The Americans have a devil's gun. It does not stop." Mud, the eternal enemy of machinery, proved no match. Browning's design shrugged off grit, dust, moisture, even shrapnel. Crews dragged guns across cratered terrain and fired minutes later without malfunction. In one famous incident, a gun buried by artillery was dug out, shaken off, and returned to action as if nothing had happened. Such stories became legend. The lighter Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, changed the tempo of combat entirely. No longer were machine guns fixed anchors. Now firepower moved with advancing infantry. German stormtroopers, trained to exploit dead zones between heavy guns, suddenly found no gaps. One man wielding a BAR could hold a crossroads, defend a trench, or break an ambush. Squad tactics evolved overnight, but with power came responsibility and terror. Gun crews became prime targets. German snipers watched for muzzle flashes. Artillery observers memorized the rhythm of Browning fire. Mortars rained on any position suspected of harboring the dreaded weapon. Crews learned to relocate constantly, dragging the 100-pound setups through sludge while gas shells hissed overhead. Still, the weapons endured. In the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Browning guns formed the backbone of the push that helped end the war. Veterans later swore the sound of Browning fire was the turning point, the moment Allied soldiers believed victory was possible. When the armistice finally echoed across Europe, exhausted troops rested their hands on the weapons that had carried them through hell. Men who distrusted technology now whispered gratitude to cold steel. Some even carved initials into receivers before turning them in, unwilling to let go completely. Commanders wrote glowing reports. Foreign officers begged for licenses. Factories prepared for peacetime, unaware another world war lurked just over the horizon. Browning's designs had survived their trial by mud, blood, and chaos. And though the guns were silent now, the lessons they taught were seismic. Reliability wins battles, mobility changes strategy, and innovation, born not in government labs but in the mind of one relentless mechanic, can rewrite the future of warfare. The battlefield was quiet, but Browning's echo had only just begun. The guns that thundered across France did not retire when the armistice was signed. They followed history into every conflict that defined the 20th century. As the world stumbled into a second global war, Browning's designs returned, not as relics, but as veterans. The lighter M1919 roared from tank mounts in North Africa, from sandbag nests in Italy, and from ship rails in the Pacific. Soldiers trusted it with their lives because it never broke that trust. And looming above them all was the monstrous point, .50 caliber M2, Browning's final gift to warfare, capable of ripping through aircraft fuselages, shredding armored cars, and silencing snipers across half a mile of broken earth. On the beaches of Normandy, M2s barked from landing craft as bullets snapped past helmets. In the skies over Europe, bomber crews clung to Browning turrets as Luftwaffe fighters screamed in. In foxholes on Okinawa, Marines fed belt after belt into red-hot chambers, praying the barrels would hold. Browning's machines did far more than kill. They preserved the fragile lives of the young men behind them. After 1945, the world refused to let them fade. Korea's frozen ridges echoed with the same staccato rhythm. Vietnam's jungles flashed with familiar tracers. And decades later, when Humvees rolled through Iraq and Afghanistan, there on the turrets sat the M2, paint-chipped, barrel-worn, but still unstoppable. Tried replacements failed. Modern prototypes jammed. Browning's design remained. Meanwhile, the man behind it all never lived to see his empire of steel. Browning collapsed at his workbench in 1926, pencil still in hand. Newspapers mourned. Soldiers saluted. But in the truest sense, he never left. Every time a soldier pulled a trigger and heard reliability instead of silence, Browning's mind echoed in the mechanism. Today, engineers with supercomputers study his blueprints with disbelief. How did a man with no formal schooling create a weapon still relevant a century later? The answer lies in his philosophy. Fewer parts, more forgiveness, let natural forces do the work. Where others fought physics, Browning partnered with it. His inventions changed tactics, rewrote doctrines, and shaped nations. Millions of lives, both saved and lost, trace their fates back to one mechanic watching grass tremble in 1890. The irony is profound. A peaceful, religious craftsman forged tools that defined modern war. Yet those who knew him say he rarely discussed killing. He saw only the puzzle, the dance of springs, bolts, and controlled explosions. In museums, soldiers' children stand before the M2 and whisper, "It was my father's favorite." In armories across the world, armorers nod in respect at weapons older than they are. And somewhere, in every battlefield where reliability matters more than glory, Browning's ghost smiles quietly, knowing his machines still do the one thing he demanded. They work, always. When the smoke clears and the battlefield falls silent, the legacy of John Moses Browning remains carved not into monuments, but into the cold heart of every bolt cycle and the steady confidence of every soldier behind his creations. The story ends, but his steel never sleeps.